follows. Number one, when there is a pandemic around us, how do we combat that pandemic? So according to all of Jewish belief, of course, you've got to take into account what doctors say, and with absolute strictest measure, you have to adhere to those principles. But at the same time, we really do believe that the Torah was written before God created the world. Every energy, every secret is vested in the Torah. God took his essence and he condensed it into book form, that when a group of people studying Torah on any level, whether they're 6 years of age, 30 years of age, 40 years of age, it doesn't make a difference. When we are learning Torah, what's actually being downloaded in our head? Godly wisdom. And we are becoming, it's not just that the godly wisdom is being enveloped in our head, but our head is enveloping it. It is becoming totally one with us. We becoming totally one with godliness. And the Torah now then goes and illuminates not just the rooms and the suburbs that we live in, but the entire world becomes illuminated, elevated, inspired, healed with godly learning. And that's why it says that if there's a calamity facing the Jewish people, increase in prayer and increase in learning of Torah. We just finished Parshas Noach. And Noach, if you know the Hebrew word Torah, right? Torah, trouble, which can be used for a flood. If you juggle those letters, can read Tzohar, window of opportunity or precious jewel. So we don't look at what's around us, we look at how to mend it. Maybe at the end of the show, I'll come back to that word, just to give it to you fully. But I had a very special relationship with Mark Weiner and with Stacey's dad, and a very funny, alive, humorous, deep relationship. And Stacey and I were speaking the other day. We said we've got to do something for him. Stacey found me, she wanted to do something for him, both in printing of a Pirkei Avos, and also, and I suggest, well, why don't we start a shir as well? It's important to me for other reasons as well. Just close to a month ago, my father-in-law, who is a great teacher of Torah and Pirkei Avos, passed away, Rabbi Tanzer. And I certainly have to be increasing in the world in his teachings. So these two things come together. So but here's the thing of the class. If I'm not clear, you got to ask. The shir will never be more than a half an hour. Please, if I'm not clear, ask. Okay, that's the rule to everybody here. Okay, let's go. So we're going to start now. I don't know if you've learned it, if you haven't learned it, but there are different levels of learning Pirkei Avos. I'm going to start with Mishnah 1. So there's a lot of introductions to give, and there's a lot of things to teach around it, but we're starting with Mishnah 1. Mishnah 1 is not Kol Yisrael. Kol Yisrael is the introduction. We will come back to that. We're starting with Moshe Kibbel. Stacey, what was your dad's name, Hebrew name?
Matityahu Mordechai ben Yosef.
Okay, beautiful. And my father was Avram Chaim ben Yaakov. So let's go. We're going to start now. Okay. Moshe Kibbel Torah Sinai, Umosri Yeshua. Guys, if I'm not clear, please ask. Moshe Kibbel Torah Sinai. Moses received the Torah from Sinai. Umosri Yeshua, and Moses passed it on to Joshua. Yeshua is a Zakanim, and Joshua passed it on to the elders. The Zakanim and Neviim. The elders passed it over to the prophets. Neviim Mosrul Anshek Knesset Gdola. The prophets passed it on to the men of the great assembly. Haim, the men of the great assembly. Omru, they said Shlosha Dvarim. They said three things. Have you Masudim Bedin? Be patient in judgment. Be patient in speaking. Be patient. Be deliberate. Vehemidu Talmidim Harbe. Raise up many students. Va'asu Saig LeTorah, and make a fence around the Torah. Good. We finished Mishnah 1. Clear? Everybody clear? I can't see everybody's on mute, but I take it it's clear. Any questions?
No.
Well, you should have a whole bunch of questions. Question number one. Take down these notes if you take notes. Moses did not receive the Torah from Sinai. Moses received the Torah at Sinai from God. So why does it say Moshe Kibbel Torah Sinai? When these words were put together, they were very carefully done. That's number one. Question number two. I know this already. Anybody who's got up to this stage in Jewish learning knows what I've just said to you, that Moses received the Torah from Sinai and passed it on to Joshua. Let me clarify what this book is. When God gave the Torah at Sinai 5,770 something years ago and 30 something years ago, when God gave the Torah, he gave it written and he gave it oral. In other words, Moses went up there and he downloaded. You've got the 5 books of Moses, as we know, the Chumash. Eventually that develops into the whole of Tanakh, that which the non-Jews call the Old Testament. That becomes known as the written Torah. But Moses also downloads. He downloads an app called the oral tradition. And it's all oral. It's the tools with which you decipher the written Torah. Nothing in the written Torah makes sense. Nothing is clear. It says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And we know we never take somebody's eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. It says you're not allowed to cook a kid in its mother's milk. And we know it means you're not allowed to eat meat, milk, and other things. Right? So nothing is literal in the Torah. God gave us tools with which to decipher and develop the laws. In other words, God makes us a partner to develop this Torah. Unbelievable. Now, that Torah was always oral. And if you had a question, well, everybody lived in Israel. If you had a question, there was the great, all the sages got together in the Sanhedrin. You could clarify anything. Now, remember also, we are not robots. If I'm naturally stricter and my colleague is naturally more lenient, that's the way God made our souls, then he's going to see things from a lenient point of view, and I'm going to be strict. So two people can be right, by the way. The question is, what's right for the average human being? Anyways, so it all goes into the oral tradition. If you had a question, you went to your rabbi. Eventually, it went to the Sanhedrin. And that's how it was kept oral. You weren't allowed to write down anything, including prayer, by the way. You had the written Torah, everything else was oral. Now, there's a great advantage of something being oral. If it's oral, you know it much better. When I was at school, we knew our tables, 10 times table, 11 times table, we knew it off by heart. Today, I have to use a calculator. I can't remember any of it because once something becomes written, it loses that energy that you use to remember it. Okay, but what was happening, it was the year 3949. The sage of the time was a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi. We'll learn a lot about him. He saw the Jewish people going into exile. He said, "Oi, I better write this down." And he writes a book. He says, the Jews are going into exile. They won't be able to clarify anything anymore. We're not going to be in Israel. We're going to be in Algiers. We're going to be in Iraq. We're going to be in Morocco. We're going to be all over the place. I better write it down. And he writes down a book that's not a book called the Mishnah. It's just the heads of argument, so to speak, because he still wanted to be kept alive. Okay, after he completed the Mishnah, in about 150 years of our common era, they wanted to know what the Mishnah meant. So for 300-400 years, they debated that, and that became known as the famous Gemara. But anyways, come back to Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi. He edits the book. I will put on your WhatsApp chat over here a timeline after the shiur that you can have it. It's quite nice to see. So Moses received. Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi writes it down in this book. That's not a book. He puts it into 6 orders. Order 1 is agricultural law. Order 2 with a whole bunch of volume. Order 2 with a whole bunch of volumes is Shabbos and Yom Tov law. And then there's marriage law. And then there's other law. And eventually you get to business and damages. In the section of business and damages is Pirkei Avos, the book that we're learning now, which reads about business, interpersonal relationships, etc., etc. Now, most of Mishnah is arguments backwards and forward. The only one that is not is Pirkei Avos, the one that we're learning now. It's not arguments. It seems to be credos, teachings, and sayings. Okay. So the question you have to have now, if this book was written by Moses at God, if this book comes from God, in other words, it's not like Aristotle's book that's man-made, but these are really godly laws, right? And the Torah wanted to tell us this, the oral law wanted to teach us this, it should have been at the very first volume of the oral law, not volume 47 of which this book is. It should have been right at the beginning of oral law as an introduction to the oral law. It should have told you that Moses received the Torah from Sinai and passed it on to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets gave it to the men of the great assembly. Why does it wait till here? That's another question. Okay, and we also know it. Anybody who's learned up until this stage knows that Moses received the Torah from Sinai and passed it on to all the other people after him. And by the way, who are all these people and who are the men of the great assembly? And another question you have to ask is, the men of the great assembly didn't just say 3 things, they said 3,000 things. So what it says, they said 3 things. Okay. To cut to the chase in the time that we have, in fact, realize this, and every other aspect of Jewish law is not a history book. It's not here for historical purposes. Every teaching in this book is to teach you how to become a mensch. Every book in the book of Shabbos is to teach you how to keep Shabbos. Every book in the book of Yuma is to teach you how to keep Yom Kippur. This book over here is to teach you how to become a mensch, which is so important to know, by the way, because in life it's much easier to learn action than to learn character development. And here the Torah assures us that no matter what age you've been, no matter what age you are, no matter what you've been through in life, you can always better yourself. And it comes out that this first Mishnah over here is not there for historical purposes, but actually, if you know it well, it's a 5-step program of how to transform your life. Today is the 7th of Cheshvan. We all decided that we're doing something better to better ourselves and better the world. How do we learn to do it? Each Mishnah in this book will tell you exactly how to better your life, practically. And this Mishnah is no different. It's a 5-step program of how to better your life. Okay, so let's learn that. Let's learn how this becomes a 5-step program of how to better your life. And it says that Moshe kibbel Torah miSinai. So the simple way of learning it is Moses received the Torah from God at Sinai. But it doesn't say that. It says Moses received the Torah from Sinai. Aha. The question you have to ask is, if God was giving the Torah to the world, because remember, God didn't have to give the Torah to this world, this Torah that brought ethics and morality and really transforms the world on many, many different levels. It makes physical spiritual. We will elaborate on that concept at another time, but you have no idea what it was, a gift for the world that God gave the Torah to the world. So if God was giving this Torah to the world, that God wrote the Torah and then he created the world, surely this divine wisdom, the wisdom of wisdoms, should have been given on the tallest mountain, Everest. And if you want to say that God wanted to give it in the Sinai Peninsula, then he should have chosen the tallest mountain in the Sinai Peninsula. Why does he choose Sinai? So commentary says, because Sinai was the smallest of the mountains, showing its humility. And Torah can only rest on humility. And that's what it says, that Moses received the Torah from Sinai. The nuance is Moses received the Torah because of his humility. You can only receive the Torah if you are humble. So the first step in transforming your life, because this is not history, it's for us today on the 7th day of Cheshvan. We all want to better our lives. What is the first ingredient? What is the first step we have to take? What is the first teaching we have to inculcate within our lives? We have to have humility. What does humility mean now? Now, humility is not a suggestion. Humility is something that can be taught. Humility is something that can be downloaded, but you have to be humble. So why was Moses, human, physical, finite man, able to receive the entire Torah, not part of the Torah, the entire Torah, because of his humility? The first ingredient that all of us in the shir today need to transform our life is humility. How do you get humility? So we're going to discuss it, because most people don't know what humility is. I would say, and I'm open to suggestions on the class today, but I would say that the first step of humility is a person who is able to listen more than he's able to talk, more than he has to talk. A humble person, I've had the opportunity to meet truly great humble people, by the way. And humble people don't mean they're miserable people, and doesn't mean they're not joyful people. A humble person is, he doesn't have to talk. He listens more than he talks. I'll give you an analogy. A young kid of 20 comes to see you and asks for advice. Kid comes for advice, and as you start speaking, the kid says, well, if the kid interrupts and says, well, I know that, and I know that, and I know that. And as you get to sentence 2, but I know that too. Eventually you say to the kid, well, kid, I can't talk to you anymore. I like you, but I can't teach you because you know it all. You're like Google. So a person cannot grow unless they're able to hear, unless they're able to talk, unless they're able to put themselves on mute. Not that I want you girls to put yourself on mute today, but if you're on mute, if you can at times just be able to listen more than you talk, that is the first step of humility. The person who's not humble is always speaking. He's always giving advice. He's giving advice even when advice wasn't asked for. I once heard a beautiful line from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He said, I only give advice when somebody asks me. But you will see that somebody who's full of themselves is always giving advice. A person who's not humble will walk into a restaurant, call the owner over, and give them advice. Even the owner is doing exceptionally well in their business, will give them advice on how they should be running their business. My friend Robbie Brosen from Nando's tells me, every so often a person comes and tells them exactly how they should be running their business, etc., etc., etc. So humility means that you don't have to always give your advice. When it's called for, you give it. Humility means you speak far less than you listen. Humility also means, by the way, that you don't take yourself so serious, i.e. that somebody can insult you, somebody can hurt you, and you're forgiving. Not that you're a patsy, not that you're a weakling, not that you don't have backbone, but you just let it go. Okay, so they insulted me. An arrogant person will never forgive. And that's why you see that a humble person always forgives. They're forgiving people by nature. They're forgiving, and they go back to, they'll even have a better relationship than afterwards, because humble people understand that people make mistakes and they're entitled to make mistakes. And I've seen the humble people that I've met are very forgiving and are very cheery, by the way. So another thing about a humble person doesn't think that they're better than anybody else, that they have to push the line. They get there, non-humble people and people, they got to jump the line. Yes, they're not there. They're like everybody else. And these are some of the things that I think are what humility is. And you might have others. And I'd like people to post it on the group afterwards if you have other ideas of what humility is. But to me, humility means where you don't take yourself so serious. You can be insulted. You don't insult back. You know, and that's not because you're weakening. Humility is where you just look at yourself as a regular person, even though you're so great. And they say about Moses knew he was great. But what he did say is, he said, wow, if somebody had my qualities and got the attention that God gave me, he would have been greater than me. So that is all humility. So the first step in changing your life is you need humility. You need to be able to listen more than you talk. You need to not take yourself seriously. And by the way, that can be taught. If I write down today, first step in changing my life is humility, I'm going to become a little bit more humble, and I'm in stumbling in one of these areas that is the antithesis of humility. Well, from now on, I'm going to be humble. I'm going to teach myself to do that. I'm going to teach myself that if I'm giving advice to everybody else, I'm not going to be giving advice to everybody else unless I'm asked for. I can literally make it as a program. That's humility. And that's the first step that one needs to transforming one life. Who does Moses give it to? Moses gives it to Joshua. Now, who's Joshua? The question that you have to ask is, why does Joshua get the Torah and not Moses' sons or Aaron's sons? Why dafka Joshua? Because in Jewish law, by the way, a son is first choice, his first preference. So commentary explains, why does Joshua get the Torah? Why does he become the next leader after him? Because Joshua had a quality that nobody else had. That day and night he stayed by Moses' tent learning. Joshua had a quality called diligence, perseverance, commitment. He was apt. He took upon himself something to do. He did it day and night, he did it. He didn't sway backwards and forwards. He didn't sway backwards and forwards. He committed to do something, he did it. So the question we have to ask ourselves now, are we like that? If we take upon ourselves something to do, are we serious enough that whatever we take upon ourselves, we do? That doesn't mean you can't ever give up something. But if you think through to do something, now you look around, how many people start a business and the first obstacle, they give it up? How many people start a hobby? You go into people's garages, it's probably the asset test, and you see all the different hobbies that were taken upon, started for 3 months, gave it up. This, that, gave it up. How many of us take upon ourselves things and the first obstacle, we just give it up? That's why I imagine there are probably more treadmills around in people's houses, almost brand new, than you can imagine. Because people take upon ourselves all sorts of things. We just don't have commitment to see it through. And the truth of the matter is, the second ingredient that is needed to achieving that, what you have to achieve in life, is day and night through good times and hard times, and not to give it up. And by the way, let's say the thing that I'm trying to fix up is something that I'm trying to achieve in life, or a character flaw that I know I have. I can fix it up with absolute commitment, day and night, fighting over any obstacle. I can do it. So for example, let's use the simplest. I like to bite my nails. If I really wanted to stop biting, I don't, but let's say I did. If I really wanted to stop biting my nails, I would get mustard sauce, put them on the nails like they do, and eventually you stop. But what I'm trying to say there, that even something that's habitually ingrained within a person can be transformed, can be changed, can be taken away with absolute commitment, day and night. Writing it down, I am fixing up this thing. And I don't have to renovate my entire house immediately, but I have to do it step by step. And those things that I want to do, I have to make a list and do it. Okay, I just, on this point, sorry, so every so often a phone call comes through. On this point, I want to say that, when one starts, you can't renovate your entire house immediately, and you can't renovate your entire life immediately. You can start, but this is the most amazing thing. I want to give you an analogy. Let's say there's a person who buys a house in the middle of Glen Hazel, and the only house they can afford is a stunkene house. It's a terrible house. Nothing is renovated, but it's the only house they can afford. So they had choice. Did they want to move into Yeovil, or did they want to move into Glen Hazel? They decided to buy in Glen Hazel, but the house was dilapidated. Now, when they walk in, they know if they don't have a plan, they move in. They move in. When the visitors come, one after one, they're embarrassed about the house. They're embarrassed. They're always apologizing for the house. But if the young couple sits down and says, this year we're actually renovating the kitchen. The following year, we're doing the pantry. The following year after that, we're doing the main bedroom. The following year after that, we're doing one of the toilets. The following year after that, we're doing the bathroom. And they have a 10-year plan of how to renovate the house. When somebody walks into the house and looks at them with their trestle table tables in this dilapidated place, they are actually so comfortable with themselves because they see the end product. And the same thing with life. As long as you have a plan for your life, as long as you have a plan, you know where you're going, you know what you're renovating, already at home with yourself. You're not insecure. What makes an insecure person when a person doesn't know what they have to do? And that's why it's absolutely important in the Torah to have a clear, defined thing, which obviously can change and develop as you go along, but to have a clear journey in life for what I'm going to achieve and accomplish. And that's what we learn from Joshua. We learn commitment, etc., etc. So the first step you need is the humility of Moses, and the second step you need is the determination, perseverance, diligence of Joshua. Who does Joshua give it to? He gives it to the elders. The elders were not old people. They were a level of prophet that were wise. Now, generally, when you speak about an elder, you think of him as old because he's got experience. And I'm going to say over here that the elders were a level of sage that were wise people. What is a wise person? A wise person, the quality that he has, of course he can have knowledge, of course he can be intelligent, but a wise person can always see the bigger picture. A wise person knows that if you have a function, and it's a bat mitzvah on a Sunday afternoon, and the waiter forgot to bring 3 bottles of wine. Don't go screaming, shouting, messing up everybody's simcha. Just be wise. Just see the bigger picture. Okay, we didn't have the wine. We didn't have the grape juice. Or if you have some celebrities over for supper, and one of your kids goes and breaks something on the main table at the beginning, just leave it. Or else you're going to muck up everything. Always see the bigger picture. When you see the bigger picture, that's the key. When you see the big picture, you don't have to win every battle, you have to win the war. And sometimes you let some of the battles go. So that's the first thing. You have to have the humility of Moses. You have to have the diligence, commitment of Joshua. And then you always have to see the bigger picture. And by the way, the difference between an elder and a bright person can cause a lot of trouble. He can cause a lot of trouble. A wise person knows not to cause trouble. And the way I want to teach the next one, the prophets, who were the prophets? Of course, they were special people. But they might not have been as wise as the elders. But one thing a prophet can do, he can see the unintended consequence. In other words, he might not be able to see the bigger picture, but he can see that if I'm driving down Ridge Road at 150 kilometers an hour and I hit a bit of oil, what can happen? He sees the unintended consequence. That life every day needs a miracle to get through it. But I've got to play within that rule. The unintended consequence. That if I curse you out, you might just curse me out much worse. If I punch you in the face, you might punch me in the face much harder. And that's what you need in life. You need the humility of Moses. You need the diligence, commitment, and perseverance of Joshua. You need to always be able to see the bigger picture in life. And of course, you need to see the unintended consequence. You need to be like an architect. Boom, what's going to happen? You've got to be able to see that. There's an old saying by Einstein or by Jonathan Baer, they say that you can't go to a bar every night and get drunk and expect a different outcome than you had the night before. That's being a prophet. And who did they give it to? Who did the prophets give it to? The men of the great assembly. Now, let me give you the timeline. The men of the great assembly were like this. So the timeline is as follows. Moses took the Jewish people out of Egypt in the year 2448. I will post afterwards the timeline. Joshua takes them into Israel in 2488. They're there for about 800 years, and the first temple is destroyed, and the Jewish people go to Babylon. And Babylon falls to Persia. There's still prophets amongst them. Mordechai, Esther's there, and we have the famous Purim story. And straight after the Purim story, the Jewish people, I think it's Darius, Esther's son, allows them to go back to Israel. And 42,000 Jews go back to Israel. They were the men of the great assembly. Why were they called great? So it was Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel was amongst them. They go back to Israel. And they look at Israel, and Israel is desolate. Israel is totally destroyed. Not only that, They're dealing with a very assimilated people because Jewish people went off to Iraq and Persia and assimilated very quickly. They became wealthy. They lost their language. They lost their customs. They forgot how to daven. All these things. This is what they were dealing with. They come back to a desolate Israel with extreme poverty, by the way, extreme poverty. And the men of the Great Assembly said, "Oi, we better make a difference here." And what did they do? They organized our religion like they knew it today, like we know it today. They said like this: if you're going to allow people to pray like we did before, in their own language, in their own tongue, they don't know Hebrew anymore, we better fix this up. So they made what we call the Amidah. The Shemona Esrei comes from them. Kiddush, Havdalah, all comes from them. They organized our religion like we have it today because they knew they were dealing with people who had lost a lot of it. And they were the men of the Great Assembly. Why were they called great? They weren't as great as Moses or as Joshua, but why were they called great? Because they made a difference. They didn't keep the knowledge for themselves. They made their difference. They made a difference. What does it mean they made a difference? I always say there are three types of people. One type of person walks into a room. I'm going to use that analogy. It's a room, a communal room, and it's cold. So what does he do? He walks out and he criticizes the management, and he's criticizing. That's the guy who's always criticizing. That's one type of person. Another person walks in, the room is cold. So what does he do? He's selfish. He goes and puts on a coat and he warms himself. Takes one of the communal coats and warms himself. The third person, he's great. What does he do? He goes and collects the wood, chops it up and makes a fire and warms up everybody. And that's what it means to be great. If you have all the knowledge in your head and you're not sharing it, you're not great. If you have all the wealth and you're not sharing and not making a difference in this world, you're not. Great is making a difference around you. And I don't care if you only know an aleph, teach an aleph. If you can do a little bit. Change things around you. Don't accept the status quo. That's what it means to be great. And that's the 5-step program to transforming your life. Humility, we discussed it at length, what that means. Diligence and perseverance of Joshua, always seeing the bigger picture of the elder, always being able to see the unintended consequence that's going to happen. 4, and also the 5th thing is make a difference. Make a difference around you. I'm going to keep you a little bit longer today because I want to finish the Mishnah. So I'll keep you another 5 minutes if I may. Now the men of the Great Assembly, of course they said thousands of things, but there were 3 credos, teachings, sayings that they lived with, that actually they felt was imperative for the perseverance, for the to preserve the Jewish people, for the preservation of the Jewish people. That's what was on their head, the preservation of the Jewish people. Number 1, be patient in judgment. So it's speaking. Number 1, it's speaking to a judge. Right? Don't take anything nonchalant. You're dealing with people's lives in front of you, but it could also be dealing with a teacher. You've got to, it could be dealing with a boss, it could be dealing with a parent. Be patient. Don't think you know it all. Think things through always. Every situation is different. Be very, very patient and be deliberate and be clear. That's number 1. So get that into your head. You cannot just assume things because you assume things. Everything has to be thought through. That's number 1. Okay? People are not robots. People do make mistakes. You've got to think it through. That's number 1. Be very patient with people. And also, I think it means when you're teaching, be deliberate, be clear, don't waffle. Number 2, Salmidim Harbe. Raise up many students. What does that mean? Not everybody agreed with that. Remember, they're now trying to rebuild Judaism after the destruction of the temple. Who do you focus in on? So there are 4 types of teachers, if you'll remember from school. Teacher number 1 is the teacher who didn't care at all. Didn't care at all. Got that was a salary, didn't care. We're not talking about, that's 1. Teacher 2 taught quite well, but only worried about the clever in the class. As long as they got their 20%, as long as that class got its 12 distinctions, they were happy. But 80% of the class just sat at the back of the class, not really part of it. The teacher felt satisfied because the boffins understood what was going on, and the boffins went on to be very successful. That's the second type of teacher. The third type of teacher worried about every student in the class and taught to every student. Great teacher, caring teacher, but that's not the ultimate. The ultimate teacher is the person who raised up out of the students. He made them teachers. He made them leaders, and that's the ultimate leader. I once heard of Jonathan Sacks. You can see it on tape. May he be well. Jonathan Sacks once said he met great, great people. The only one who brought up the leader within him, the only one who made him feel great was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. You can hear him say it. He says it at much greater length. So ultimately, it's not just that you teach down to people, but you teach people, you raise them up to become leaders. Now, you must remember, it sounds much simpler than it is, because these people had very limited means. The Jewish people had just been destroyed because of the destruction of the first temple. They were totally assimilated. He said, go for everybody. Raise up everybody. Raise up everybody. And they said a third thing. A third thing to transform your life, if you want your life to be preserved in your teachings, the asu saig Torah. There are two meanings in this. You've got to have disciplines, and your children have to have disciplines. If you know it all and you're transmitting it to your kids, and your kids don't have disciplines, you're in trouble. Analogy: you're living in a busy street. If you don't have a gate, fence, the kid is either going to be scared to run out of the front door, or they're going to run into the road and get knocked over. You visit the Empire State Building. If there's no guardrail on top, you're either petrified to go out because you've got heights, or you're going to fall off. A wind's going to chap you and fall off. But if there's a strong guardrail there, you can walk onto the guardrail. Yes, it's a bit of a restriction, but you can see the entire Manhattan. So a fence on the one hand gives you a restriction, but at the same time, it gives you a sense of freedom that you can see far beyond and feel free far beyond than if you wouldn't have a fence. So you've got to have fences around yourself. Okay. So let me quickly sum it up. You've got to have humility. We taught you how to have humility, diligence. You've got to be able to see the bigger picture. You've got to see the unintended consequence. You've got to make a difference. Write these down points. What differences am I making this week? If you want to use this as tools, because this is a tool to change your life. And number three, you've got to be very clear, patient. You've got to raise up everybody, worry about every one of your kids. And the most important thing is you've got to put fences and disciplines. There is another definition in putting a fence around the Torah, and that is not just disciplines, but the other meaning is that when a teacher is teaching on Zoom, with the challenges that it brings, he's got to put a fence around his teachings. He's got to know when to say, it's enough. So I'm going to stop there with the class. Are there any questions? If not, I'll see you next Monday at 9 a.m. Any questions? Gee, I was clear.
Rabbi, I've got a question. Is another trait of humility someone that does charitable deeds but doesn't tell anyone about them, does them almost in secret?
So I'll tell you yes, it is. I would like, actually, if you want the show to really be active, if anybody has any thoughts or disagrees with what I said, post it on the chat. I would say that is, to some, I would say that is a certain sense of humility. Sure. Now, there are times, by the way, where you do want to publicize, and I'll tell you why. Well, the humble person doesn't need the notoriety. There's no doubt. But the humble person does not want the notoriety. But at the same time, it does encourage other people to do good. Do you understand the difference? The humble person doesn't need his name in lights. But there are times that you want to publicize it because it encourages others. It encourages others. So,
thank you, Rabbi.
So if ever I become rich, I've decided I'm going to give all my donations anonymously, but I'm going to tell everybody I'm anonymous. Be good. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.